Rain hammered the streets of downtown Chicago before sunrise. The city looked washed in grey shadows and cold light. Most people hurried toward warm offices and quiet routines. Evelyn Carter walked in the opposite direction with purpose. At 42, she had spent her life fighting for justice. Years as a federal prosecutor had taught her discipline, patience, and restraint. Those lessons would soon be tested in ways she never imagined. Evelyn stepped from a black sedan and adjusted her navy business suit. In one hand, she carried a leather briefcase filled with case files. The courthouse towered above her like a monument to law itself. 3 weeks earlier, she had accepted a position that changed her life forever. Very few people outside courthouse leadership knew about her new role. She preferred it that way. Respect earned through actions always mattered more than titles. The private judicial entrance was temporarily closed because of electrical repairs. That inconvenience forced Evelyn toward the main security checkpoint. She glanced at her watch. It was only 6:45 a.m. She still had enough time to prepare for the important proceedings scheduled that morning. Several criminal cases awaited careful review. Families, victims, and defendants would soon depend on her judgment. Near the entrance stood Officer Daniel Mercer. 50 years old and nearing retirement, he had worked courthouse security for more than 15 years. His reputation depended on being tough and suspicious. Some co-workers admired that attitude. Others quietly worried about it. Mercer watched Evelyn approach and immediately narrowed his eyes. "Hold it right there," he barked. Evelyn stopped calmly. "Good morning, officer." Mercer ignored the greeting. His gaze moved across her clothing, briefcase, and face. Something about her presence seemed to irritate him before she had spoken more than 3 words. He stepped closer. "This entrance isn't for visitors," he said sharply. "I understand," Evelyn replied. "I'm not a visitor." Instead of asking questions, Mercer laughed under his breath. "Everybody says that." Evelyn felt a familiar disappointment settle inside her. Throughout her career, she had encountered people who made assumptions before learning facts. Experience had taught her not to react emotionally. Still, the disrespect stung. "If you'll allow me to explain," she began. "No explanation needed," Mercer interrupted. He motioned toward another officer across the plaza. "Take the public entrance and stop wasting our time." Several courthouse employees arriving for work slowed their pace. They sensed tension building. A few exchanged uneasy looks. Evelyn noticed phones appearing in hands. The rain intensified. Water dripped from the courthouse steps. For a moment she considered revealing exactly who she was. One sentence could end the confrontation instantly. Yet something held her back. Why should anyone need a powerful title to receive basic respect? "Officer," she said quietly, "I belong in this building." Mercer's expression hardened. "We'll see about that," he answered. He reached for his radio and called for assistance. Across the plaza, a second officer started moving toward them through the rain. Evelyn watched him approach and felt a strange certainty. This morning was no longer about a delayed arrival. Something much larger had just begun, and before the day ended, the entire courthouse would be forced to confront a truth it had ignored for years. The second officer arrived within seconds. His name was Eric Collins, younger than Mercer and far less confident. He looked from Mercer to Evelyn, sensing immediately that something was wrong. The tension in the air felt heavier than the rain falling around them. "Problem?" Collins asked. "Restricted access violation," Mercer replied, refusing instructions. Evelyn remained composed. "That isn't accurate. I haven't refused anything. I've simply tried to explain why I'm here." Mercer waved dismissively. "See? More excuses." Several courthouse employees had stopped completely now. A maintenance supervisor stood beneath an awning, watching carefully. 2 clerks whispered to each other near the entrance doors. Nobody intervened. People rarely stepped between authority and its target. Evelyn noticed their hesitation. She understood it. Fear often disguised itself as neutrality. "Officer Collins," she said politely, "perhaps you could help clarify this misunderstanding." Before Collins could respond, Mercer stepped forward. "There is no misunderstanding. She doesn't belong here." The certainty in his voice surprised even Collins. "Did you check identification?" Collins asked quietly. Mercer hesitated for half a second. "She never provided any." "Did you ask for it?" A brief silence followed. Mercer's jaw tightened. I don't need a lecture on procedure. Evelyn noticed Collins glance toward her briefcase. Something in his expression suggested doubt. He seemed uncomfortable with how quickly the situation had escalated. The courthouse clock struck 7. Employees continued arriving, some openly recorded with their phones now. Word spread fast inside government buildings. Rumors traveled even faster. Mercer suddenly grabbed Evelyn's arm. You're leaving, now! Gasps echoed from nearby observers. Evelyn looked directly at him. Officer, there is absolutely no reason for physical contact. You've had your chance. Collins stepped forward nervously. Daniel, maybe we should slow down. I said she's leaving. Years of courtroom experience helped Evelyn remain calm. Inside, however, anger burned steadily. Not because of herself, because she knew countless others had likely faced similar treatment without witnesses, recordings, or resources. Mercer tightened his grip and began pulling her backward. Collins reluctantly assisted. The leather briefcase slipped from Evelyn's hand and struck the wet concrete. Papers remained inside, but the sound echoed across the plaza like an insult. Phones rose higher. Someone shouted, "What are you doing?" Mercer ignored the question. Evelyn did not resist. She kept her shoulders straight and her expression controlled. Dignity was sometimes the strongest form of resistance available. As they dragged her across the pavement, courthouse employees watched in stunned silence. A young law clerk looked horrified. An older administrative assistant shook her head slowly. The scene lasted less than a minute. Yet those 60 seconds would alter multiple lives. Finally, Mercer released her near the public entrance. Stay here, he ordered, where you belong. Evelyn adjusted her jacket and picked up her briefcase. Rainwater covered the leather surface. Her arm throbbed where Mercer had grabbed it. For the first time, a flicker of emotion crossed her face. Not fear, not humiliation, disappointment. Deep disappointment. She looked toward the courthouse windows. Several people inside stared back. Some recognized her. Others were beginning to realize who she might be. Then something unexpected happened. A black SUV turned into the courthouse driveway. The vehicle belonged to Chief Judge Margaret Reynolds. As it approached the entrance, Mercer straightened proudly, unaware that the woman he had just dragged across the pavement was one of the very judges Reynolds had sworn into office only 3 weeks earlier. Inside the SUV, Chief Judge Reynolds looked through the rain-streaked glass, saw Evelyn standing beside the entrance, and immediately understood that something had gone terribly wrong. Chief Judge Margaret Reynolds stepped from the SUV before the driver could open her door. Rain soaked the shoulders of her coat as she moved quickly across the plaza. Her expression was calm, but anyone who knew her understood the danger hidden behind that calmness. Officer Mercer immediately smiled. "Good morning, Judge Reynolds," he called confidently. She ignored the greeting. Her eyes were fixed on Evelyn. "Are you all right?" Reynolds asked. The question hung in the air. Several employees froze. Collins blinked. Mercer's smile vanished. "I'm fine," Evelyn answered, "though this morning has been unexpectedly educational." Reynolds studied the wet marks on Evelyn's sleeve and the damaged briefcase. Her face hardened. "Educational for whom?" Evelyn glanced briefly toward Mercer. "Perhaps for everyone involved." The chief judge slowly turned. "Officer Mercer," she said. "Yes, Your Honor." "Do you know who this woman is?" Mercer's stomach tightened. He suddenly felt less certain. "No, ma'am. She attempted to access a restricted entrance without authorization." The silence that followed felt endless. Then Reynolds spoke 4 words that changed everything. "This is Judge Carter." Nobody moved. Nobody breathed. Even the rain seemed quieter. Collins stared at Evelyn. The maintenance supervisor dropped his coffee cup. A court clerk covered her mouth. Mercer's face drained of color. "Judge Carter?" "The Honorable Evelyn Carter," Reynolds continued, "recently appointed to Criminal Division 3, a member of this court, one of your employers." Mercer looked at Evelyn as if seeing her for the first time. His mind raced desperately through the last 15 minutes. The accusations, the insults, the physical force, the witnesses, the cameras. Every decision suddenly looked catastrophic. "Your Honor, I didn't know," he stammered. Evelyn's response came quietly. "You never asked." The words landed harder than any shout. Around them, courthouse employees exchanged stunned glances. News spread instantly through text messages and whispered conversations. Mercer felt the ground shifting beneath his feet. For 15 years, he had believed experience made him an expert judge of character. Now that confidence felt like a trap closing around him. "Judge Carter," Collins said carefully, "I sincerely apologize." Evelyn nodded. "Thank you, Officer Collins." The distinction did not go unnoticed. Reynolds folded her arms. "Officer Mercer, report to my office immediately after your shift." "Yes, Your Honor." "Actually," Reynolds corrected, "report there now." A murmur spread through the crowd. Everyone understood what that meant. Mercer was being removed from duty. Immediately. For the first time, genuine fear appeared in his eyes. Not fear of discipline, fear of consequences, the kind that follow documented actions, the kind that survive long after excuses disappear. As courthouse security escorted Mercer away, Evelyn finally entered the building. Employees stepped aside respectfully. Many looked embarrassed, not because they had done anything directly, oh shy, because they had watched, because they had remained silent. Inside her chambers, Evelyn changed into judicial robes and prepared for the morning docket. Defendants waited, attorneys organized files, families filled courtroom benches. Life inside the justice system continued moving forward. Yet her mind kept returning to the incident, not because she was a judge, because she knew what would have happened if she were not, if she had been an ordinary citizen, if no witnesses had recorded it, if no powerful title existed behind her name. By lunchtime, local news stations were already requesting information. By afternoon, courthouse administrators were reviewing surveillance footage. By evening, reporters had discovered something even more troubling. The footage revealed that during the previous 12 months, Officer Mercer had stopped minority visitors nearly 14 times more often than white visitors entering the same building. What began as one embarrassing incident was rapidly becoming something much larger, and hidden inside those records was evidence that threatened not only Mercer's career, but the reputation of the entire courthouse administration. 3 days later, the courthouse felt different. Conversations stopped when administrators entered rooms. Security officers avoided eye contact in hallways. Rumors moved through the building faster than official memos. Judge Evelyn Carter sat alone in her chambers, reviewing evidence gathered by internal investigators. What she saw disturbed her far more than the incident itself. The problem was not one officer. The problem was a culture, a pattern, a system that had quietly accepted behavior nobody wanted to examine too closely. The surveillance records covered nearly 2 years. Hundreds of interactions appeared routine. Others raised serious questions. Again and again, minority attorneys, court employees, and visitors experienced greater scrutiny than white counterparts. Some incidents seemed small. Extra questions, longer delays, additional identification requests, but when viewed together, they formed a disturbing picture. Bias rarely arrived wearing a sign. Most often it arrived disguised as procedure. Evelyn highlighted several cases. A black attorney delayed 20 minutes before a hearing. A Latina court reporter questioned repeatedly despite years of employment. An Asian law professor forced to verify credentials multiple times. Meanwhile, similar white visitors passed through with minimal scrutiny. Numbers never carried emotions. That was what made them powerful. The numbers spoke clearly. That afternoon, Chief Judge Reynolds convened an emergency administrative meeting. Every department head attended: security supervisors, court administrators, human resources officials, legal counsel. The atmosphere resembled a storm waiting to break. "This is no longer an isolated incident," Reynolds began. Nobody argued. Nobody could. The evidence made denial impossible. Security Director Harold Benson shifted uncomfortably. "Officer Mercer had positive performance evaluations for years," he said. Judge Carter looked directly at him. "That fact concerns me more than anything else." The room fell silent. "Why?" Benson asked. "Because it suggests people noticed these patterns and rewarded them instead of questioning them." Several administrators lowered their eyes. The truth carried weight, especially when spoken aloud. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer sat inside his small suburban home outside Chicago. For the first time in 15 years, he was suspended without pay. His badge had been collected. his weapon secured, his authority removed. The television played quietly in the background. Every local news station covered the story. Some focused on the confrontation, others focused on Judge Carter. A few began investigating Mercer's history. That frightened him most. One mistake could sometimes be explained. Patterns could not. His wife Karen sat across from him. "Daniel," she said softly, "is there anything they're going to find?" The question lingered. Mercer stared at the floor. For several seconds he said nothing. That silence answered more than words ever could. Back downtown, civil rights organizations requested access to public records. Local attorneys volunteered testimony. Former courthouse visitors shared experiences online. The story grew larger each day. Many accounts sounded surprisingly similar. People described feeling unwelcome, suspected, judged before speaking. Most had never filed complaints. They assumed nothing would happen. Now they wondered if someone might finally listen. Late that evening, Evelyn remained alone in her chambers. The courthouse had emptied. Rain tapped softly against tall windows. She opened one final file investigators had delivered only hours earlier. At first it appeared ordinary, then she noticed a familiar signature. Security Director Harold Benson. Attached beneath it were 7 discrimination complaints filed against Mercer over the previous 3 years. Every complaint had been dismissed, every investigation had been closed within 24 hours, and every approval carried Benson's signature. Evelyn leaned back slowly. The evidence revealed something nobody had anticipated. The officer who dragged her across the pavement might not be the courthouse's biggest problem. Someone higher up had been protecting him all along. The discovery changed everything. Judge Evelyn Carter arrived at the courthouse before sunrise the next morning. Chicago's skyline glowed beneath heavy clouds. Lake Michigan disappeared behind a blanket of fog drifting across the city. Inside her chambers, she spread documents across a conference table. 7 complaints, 3 years. Everyone dismissed. Everyone approved by Security Director Harold Benson. The pattern was impossible to ignore. Officer Daniel Mercer had become the public face of the scandal. Yet the documents suggested something more troubling. Mercer may have acted, but someone else had enabled. Someone else had protected. Someone else had looked away. At 9 o'clock, Chief Judge Margaret Reynolds joined Evelyn for a private meeting. Neither woman spoke immediately. The evidence spoke loudly enough. Finally, Reynolds exhaled. "I trusted Benson for 15 years. Trust without accountability becomes dangerous," Evelyn replied. Reynolds nodded slowly. She knew the younger judge was right. Institutions often failed not because of obvious villains. They failed because decent people ignored uncomfortable truths. Meanwhile, investigators continued interviewing courthouse employees. What emerged was a culture built on silence. Clerks admitted they had witnessed questionable treatment for years. Attorneys described unequal enforcement of security rules. Several employees recalled hearing inappropriate comments from Mercer during breaks. Most never reported them. Some feared retaliation. Others assumed reporting would accomplish nothing. One statement particularly caught Evelyn's attention. A veteran court administrator described a meeting 18 months earlier. An employee had raised concerns about discriminatory behavior. Benson reportedly dismissed the concerns as oversensitivity. The complaint vanished shortly afterward. No investigation followed, no documentation remained. Except now, witnesses were talking, and memories could become evidence. Across town, Daniel Mercer sat inside an attorney's office. The confidence that once defined him had vanished. His lawyer, Robert Hansen, reviewed the growing stack of reports. The expression on Hansen's face grew darker with every page. "Daniel," he finally said, "I need complete honesty." Mercer remained silent. Were there previous incidents? A long pause followed. Maybe some misunderstandings. "That's not what I asked." Mercer rubbed his forehead. The room felt smaller by the minute. "People complained sometimes." "How many times?" "I don't know." Hansen closed the file. That answer usually means more than anyone wants to admit. Mercer stared through the office window. For years, he had considered himself the victim whenever complaints appeared. Now he found himself asking a question he had spent years avoiding. What if the complaints were right? The thought unsettled him, not because it threatened his career, because it threatened his identity. Back at the courthouse, reporters gathered outside the main entrance. National media outlets had arrived. Civil rights organizations demanded transparency. Legal commentators debated institutional accountability on television. The story had moved beyond Chicago. People across the country recognized something familiar within it. Many had experienced similar treatment. Different places, different uniforms, different circumstances, the same assumptions. That evening, investigators delivered another file to Judge Carter. The label seemed ordinary. Personnel records. She opened it expecting routine documents. Instead, she found a confidential memorandum written 2 years earlier. The author was Security Director Harold Benson. The recipient was the County Administration Board. One paragraph immediately captured her attention. Benson had specifically recommended Mercer for promotion. His justification was chilling. The memo praised Mercer's ability to preserve the courthouse atmosphere and identify individuals who appeared out of place before problems developed. Evelyn read the sentence twice, then a third time. The wording sounded careful, professional, defensible, yet beneath the polished language lurked something unmistakable. The same bias hidden inside so many systems. The same bias protected by vague words and unofficial understandings. For the first time, Evelyn realized the investigation was no longer about misconduct. It was about institutional complicity, and if the evidence continued leading upward, some of Chicago's most respected officials might soon find themselves answering difficult questions under oath. The investigation entered a new phase during the second week. What had started as a complaint against one suspended security officer was evolving into a public examination of the entire courthouse system. Reporters camped outside daily. National legal organizations requested updates. Civil rights advocates followed every development closely. Judge Evelyn Carter never sought the attention. She would have preferred a quiet resolution. Instead, she found herself standing at the center of a conversation much larger than her own experience. On a cold Monday morning, the courthouse conference room filled with investigators, attorneys, and administrative officials. Boxes of records lined the walls. Thousands of pages had already been reviewed. Thousands more remained. The deeper investigators looked, the more troubling the findings became. Patterns appeared where none should have existed. Complaint procedures lacked independent oversight. Disciplinary reviews often depended on personal relationships. Recommendations for promotions came from supervisors who rarely faced accountability themselves. Most concerning of all, many warning signs had been documented years earlier. Someone simply chose not to act. At 11 o'clock, Security Director Harold Benson arrived for formal questioning. His confidence remained intact, at least initially. He wore an expensive suit and carried decades of administrative experience. For years, he had been considered one of the courthouse's most reliable leaders. That reputation was now under scrutiny. Attorney Melissa Grant conducted the interview. Director Benson, how many discrimination complaints involving Officer Mercer crossed your desk? I don't recall exact numbers. Grant slid several folders across the table. There were 7. Benson adjusted his glasses. If the records say 7, then 7. Why was no formal investigation completed on any of them? The room grew quiet. Benson shifted slightly. At the time, there was insufficient evidence. Grant opened another file. Multiple witnesses, written statements, security footage references. Those seem like evidence. For the first time, Benson appeared uncomfortable. Not frightened. Uncomfortable. The distinction mattered. People who feared consequences often became defensive. People who believed themselves untouchable became annoyed. Benson looked annoyed. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer sat alone in his home, watching the proceedings unfold through news coverage. His attorney had advised him not to speak publicly. The advice made sense. Every day brought new revelations. Every revelation seemed worse than the last. Mercer noticed something disturbing. Very few people defended him anymore. Former co-workers avoided interviews. Friends stopped calling. Neighbors suddenly seemed distant. Even people who privately agreed with some of his views remained silent. When consequences arrive, support often disappears first. For years, Mercer believed loyalty flowed both directions. Now he understood a painful truth. Organizations protect themselves before they protect individuals. Across Chicago, public pressure intensified. Community meetings filled with residents demanding reform. Local churches hosted discussions about equal treatment under the law. University law professors published articles examining the case. Many focused on one central question: how many similar incidents never became public? That question haunted Evelyn as well. Late one evening, she reviewed testimony from courthouse visitors whose names never appeared in newspapers. Ordinary people, workers, parents, veterans, citizens who simply wanted fair treatment. Most had accepted humiliation because they lacked power. Unlike Evelyn, they could not command media attention. Unlike Evelyn, they could not access institutional resources. Their stories mattered every bit as much, perhaps more. Near midnight, a courier delivered another sealed package. The return address belonged to the county administration archives. Inside was a collection of emails investigators had recently recovered. One message immediately caught Evelyn's attention. It had been written 18 months earlier. The sender was Harold Benson. The recipient was a senior county official. The message discussed complaints against Mercer. One sentence stood out like a warning flare. Opening a formal investigation would create unnecessary political complications and attract attention we do not need. Evelyn stared at the screen. The implications were enormous. This was no longer negligence. This suggested deliberate suppression. Someone had known there was a problem. Someone had chosen institutional protection over justice. And for the first time, evidence existed proving it. The scandal was about to reach levels nobody had anticipated. The recovered email changed the entire direction of the investigation. By Tuesday morning, legal experts across the country were discussing its significance. News analysts no longer described the case as misconduct by a single officer. They described it as potential institutional corruption. Judge Evelyn Carter sat inside her chambers reviewing the message again. The words were impossible to misunderstand. Opening a formal investigation would create unnecessary political complications and attract attention we do not need. Harold Benson had not merely ignored complaints, he had actively discouraged scrutiny. That distinction carried serious legal consequences. Outside the courthouse, reporters crowded the sidewalks despite freezing temperatures. Camera crews stood shoulder to shoulder. Every development generated national headlines. Inside, however, the atmosphere felt less like a media event and more like a reckoning. People who had remained silent for years were finally speaking, and once silence breaks, it rarely returns. That afternoon, investigators interviewed another former courthouse employee. Her name was Angela Brooks. She had retired 6 months earlier after 23 years as an administrative supervisor. For most of her career, she avoided conflict. Now she regretted that choice. There were warnings, she testified. The room became quiet. What kind of warnings? An investigator asked. Angela folded her hands. People complained. Staff talked privately. We all knew certain visitors received different treatment. Did management know? Angela laughed sadly. Management always knows. The question is whether they care enough to act. Her testimony lasted nearly 3 hours. By the end, investigators possessed a clearer picture than ever before. The problems stretched far beyond one security officer. A culture of avoidance had protected misconduct for years. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer received unexpected visitors. 2 former co-workers stopped by his house that evening. Neither man came to defend him. Neither offered encouragement. Instead, they came seeking answers. Daniel, one asked quietly, "Did you really say those things?" Mercer knew exactly what he meant. The recordings, the comments, the language revealed during the investigation. For a moment he considered denying everything. Then exhaustion defeated pride. Some of it, he admitted. The room fell silent. His co-workers exchanged disappointed glances. One shook his head. "You know what bothers me most?" Mercer said nothing. "I worked beside you for 10 years. I kept telling myself people exaggerated. I kept making excuses." The man stood. Turns out they weren't exaggerating. After they left, Mercer remained alone in the dark living room. The television played muted news coverage. His reflection stared back from the screen. For the first time, he wondered whether the person being described by reporters was actually the person he had become. The thought unsettled him more than any legal threat. Across town, Evelyn attended a community forum hosted by local civic leaders. More than 300 people filled the auditorium. Some came seeking answers. Others came seeking hope. Several simply wanted someone powerful to acknowledge experiences they had carried for years. When Evelyn approached the podium, the room became silent. "This case is not about me," she began. The audience listened carefully. "I happen to have a title. I happen to have resources. Most people facing similar treatment have neither." Heads nodded throughout the crowd. The true measure of justice is not how we treat powerful people, it is how we treat people with no power at all. Applause erupted, not because the statement was dramatic, because it felt true. After the event ended, an elderly veteran approached her. He handed her a worn envelope. "You should see this," he said. Inside were copies of complaint letters submitted years earlier, letters describing discriminatory treatment at the courthouse, letters that had apparently disappeared from official records. Evelyn's pulse quickened. The dates stretched back almost 8 years, much further than investigators had realized. The scandal was older, much older, and if those missing complaints could be authenticated, they would prove something devastating. The cover-up had not begun with Harold Benson. It had started long before he ever took control. The envelope from the retired veteran remained on Judge Evelyn Carter's desk long after midnight. Outside, Chicago slept beneath a blanket of winter fog. Streetlights glowed through the darkness like distant lanterns. Inside her chambers, however, sleep felt impossible. The letters spread across her desk told a story nobody wanted to hear, a story older than anyone expected. 8 years of complaints, 8 years of warnings, 8 years of people describing the same patterns. The names changed, the details varied, the themes remained identical. Visitors questioned unnecessarily. Professionals treated with suspicion, citizens humiliated while attempting to access public services. Every letter ended the same way. Nothing happened. The next morning, investigators authenticated the documents. The results stunned everyone. The letters were genuine. Official tracking numbers matched archived county records. Several complaints had existed in the system before mysteriously disappearing. Others showed signs of administrative closure without review. Someone had not merely ignored evidence. Someone had erased it. By noon, a special investigative panel convened inside a secure conference room. County attorneys, ethics officials, and outside auditors filled the seats. The atmosphere felt tense, not because facts remained unclear, because the facts were becoming impossible to contain. An auditor presented a timeline stretching across nearly a decade. As names and dates appeared on the screen, a disturbing pattern emerged. Every administration had received warnings. Every administration promised improvements. Every administration ultimately did little. Different leaders, same outcome. The problem survived because institutions often protect themselves first. That truth made many people uncomfortable. Meanwhile, former Security Director Harold Benson faced questioning under oath. Unlike previous interviews, this session occurred before official investigators with subpoena authority. The tone changed immediately. "Director Benson," the lead investigator began, "did you ever intentionally suppress discrimination complaints?" "No," Benson replied. The answer came quickly. Perhaps too quickly. The investigator displayed the recovered email, then another and another. Benson's expression tightened. The messages revealed repeated efforts to minimize investigations, repeated concerns about public image, repeated discussions about avoiding controversy. Very few discussions about protecting citizens. The distinction mattered. For the first time, Benson requested a private consultation with his attorney. Observers immediately recognized the significance. Confident witnesses rarely pause proceedings. Concerned witnesses often do. Across town, Daniel Mercer received notice that federal civil rights investigators intended to interview him again. The letter arrived by certified mail. His hands trembled as he opened it. Until now, Mercer had viewed himself as the center of the case. Now he realized something unsettling. He may have been only one piece of a much larger machine, A visible peace, a replaceable peace, perhaps even a convenient peace. For years, supervisors praised his actions, promoted him, protected him, rewarded him. Now many of those same people seemed eager to distance themselves. The realization filled him with bitterness, yet bitterness could not erase responsibility. His choices remained his own. That evening, Judge Carter received an unexpected phone call. The caller identified himself as Thomas Wheeler, a retired county administrator, 76 years old, widely respected, largely forgotten. "Judge Carter," he said quietly, "there's something you need to know." His voice carried the weight of old regrets. The complaints didn't disappear by accident. Evelyn sat upright. "What do you mean?" A long silence followed, then Wheeler spoke words that changed the investigation once again. 10 years ago, a committee was formed to address discrimination concerns. "We completed a report. The findings were severe. What happened to it?" Another pause. "It was buried." Evelyn felt her heartbeat quicken. "Who buried it?" Wheeler exhaled slowly. "People far more powerful than Harold Benson." The room seemed suddenly smaller. The investigation had already exposed security failures, administrative failures, leadership failures. Now it threatened to expose political failures reaching beyond the courthouse itself. As Wheeler prepared to provide names, one reality became impossible to ignore. The closer they moved toward the truth, the more powerful the people became who had reasons to keep it hidden. The names Thomas Wheeler provided arrived the following morning in a sealed envelope. Judge Evelyn Carter opened it alone. Outside her office window, snow drifted across downtown Chicago. The city moved through another ordinary day, unaware that extraordinary revelations were about to emerge. Inside the envelope sat a list of officials connected to the buried report. Former county executives, senior administrators, political advisors. Several names still held influential positions. One currently served on a state oversight commission. Another advised elected officials on judicial policy. The implications were staggering. This was no longer a courthouse scandal. It had become a story about power protecting itself. For 10 years, perhaps longer. An emergency investigative session was scheduled immediately. Federal civil rights attorneys joined local prosecutors, independent auditors reviewed archived records, digital forensic specialists examined deleted files. Every hour seemed to reveal something new. The buried report was eventually recovered from backup storage systems. When investigators opened it, the room fell silent. The findings were devastating. Researchers had documented patterns of discriminatory treatment across multiple departments. They recommended mandatory oversight, independent complaint review boards, external audits, enhanced training, clear disciplinary procedures. The report warned that failure to act would create significant legal and ethical risks. Those recommendations had never been implemented. Instead, the report disappeared. For a decade, the investigators now possessed proof, not suspicion, not allegations. Proof. Meanwhile, Daniel Mercer entered a federal interview room for the second time. The man who once projected certainty looked exhausted. Months of scrutiny had aged him noticeably. One investigator placed several documents on the table. "Mr. Mercer, were you aware previous complaints existed before your suspension?" Mercer stared at the papers. "Some of them." "Did supervisors discuss those complaints with you?" A pause followed. "Usually they told me not to worry about it." The investigators exchanged glances. "Not to worry about it." "They said people complained all the time. They told me I was doing my job." For the first time, Mercer openly acknowledged what had happened. Not because he wanted redemption, because the evidence had removed every alternative. He had made harmful decisions, others had encouraged those decisions. Both realities could exist simultaneously. Across the city, public reaction intensified. Editorial boards demanded accountability. Community leaders called for reform. Legal scholars described the case as one of the most significant institutional bias investigations in recent Illinois history. Yet through all the attention, Evelyn remained focused on a simpler objective: truth, not revenge, not publicity. Truth. Late that afternoon, she addressed a joint meeting of courthouse employees. Hundreds attended, many appeared nervous, others seemed hopeful. Most looked tired. Years of silence carried a cost. Accountability is not punishment, Evelyn told them. The room listened carefully. Accountability is honesty. It allows institutions to become worthy of public trust. No applause followed, only thoughtful silence. Sometimes silence means people are actually listening. After the meeting ended, Chief Judge Margaret Reynolds joined Evelyn near the courtroom windows. Snow continued falling beyond the glass. "You realize what happens next," Reynolds said. Evelyn nodded. She understood perfectly. The final investigative report would soon become public. Careers would end, reputations would collapse, lawsuits would follow, institutions would be forced to change. The consequences could reach far beyond Chicago. Reynolds looked toward the city skyline. One officer thought he was deciding who belonged inside this building. Evelyn followed her gaze, and now an entire system must answer whether it deserves to belong in the public's trust. As evening settled over the city, investigators completed the final draft of their findings. The report exceeded 600 pages. Its conclusions were blunt: systemic failures, documented bias, administrative suppression, institutional negligence. The report was scheduled for public release in 48 hours. Nobody could stop it now, and hidden within its final recommendations was a proposal so sweeping that it would permanently transform courthouse operations throughout the state of Illinois. 48 hours later, every major news organization in America carried the story. The 600-page investigative report became public at exactly 9 o'clock on a cold Friday morning. Within minutes, headlines spread across television networks, newspapers, legal journals, and social media platforms. The findings shocked the nation: years of ignored complaints, documented discriminatory treatment, administrative suppression, systemic failures reaching far beyond a single courthouse. For many Americans, the report confirmed fears they had carried for years. For others, it served as a painful awakening. The evidence was impossible to dismiss. Facts rarely cared whether people felt comfortable. Inside the Chicago courthouse, employees gathered in conference rooms to watch the public announcement. Some appeared anxious, others relieved. The burden of silence had weighed heavily on many of them. Now the truth belonged to everyone. Chief Judge Margaret Reynolds stood beside Judge Evelyn Carter during the press conference. Dozens of cameras pointed toward the stage. Reporters filled every available seat. The atmosphere felt historic. Because it was. Reynolds spoke first. "Today we acknowledge institutional failures that should never have occurred. Accountability begins with honesty. Reform begins with courage." Then she stepped aside. Evelyn approached the podium. The room became completely silent. For a moment she remembered that rainy morning months earlier. The confrontation, the humiliation, the assumptions, the briefcase scraping across wet concrete. A single incident had uncovered an entire system. "This investigation was never about one person," Evelyn began. Her voice remained calm, steady, certain. "It was about whether our institutions are willing to confront uncomfortable truths." Reporters scribbled notes, cameras recorded every word. Justice does not exist because buildings are impressive. Justice exists because people choose integrity over convenience. The statement echoed throughout the room. Many understood immediately. Integrity often carries a price. Someone must be willing to pay it. The report's recommendations became law within months. Illinois adopted sweeping courthouse reforms. Independent oversight boards reviewed complaints. Mandatory transparency requirements increased accountability. Security personnel received enhanced training. Anonymous reporting protections encouraged employees to speak without fear. Other states soon followed. The reforms became known nationally as the Carter Standards, a model for institutional accountability. Meanwhile, Harold Benson resigned before disciplinary proceedings concluded. Several administrators lost their positions. Others faced ethics investigations. Careers built over decades ended within weeks. Not because of one mistake, because of years of choices, years of looking away. Daniel Mercer eventually accepted responsibility during a public statement. His words could not undo the harm. They could not erase consequences, but they represented something important. An acknowledgement that accountability begins with truth. His career in law enforcement ended permanently. The badge he once valued became a reminder of authority misused. For Evelyn, life gradually returned to normal, or as normal as possible. She continued presiding over criminal cases. Families still entered courtrooms seeking justice. Victims still needed protection. Defendants still deserved fairness. The daily responsibilities remained unchanged. Only her perspective deepened. One snowy evening, nearly a year later, she stood alone near the courthouse entrance. The same building, the same city. Everything felt different. People entered freely, respectfully, professionally. The system was not perfect. No system ever would be. But it was better than before, and better mattered. Evelyn watched citizens walk through the doors. Some carried briefcases, some carried worries, some carried hopes. All deserved dignity. That simple truth had always been the point. The greatest lesson from the entire ordeal was not about power. It was about humanity. Titles matter, positions matter, authority matters. But character matters more, because in the end, justice depends not on who people are. It depends on whether we recognize each other's worth before we know their titles. The courthouse lights glowed against the winter sky as Evelyn turned toward home. Behind her stood a stronger institution. Ahead of her stood new challenges. And somewhere between those two realities lived the enduring promise of justice. A promise worth protecting, a promise worth fighting for, a promise that belongs to everyone. Subscribe to the channel, leave a comment, and share this video.